This lawmaker wants to expand the powers of the Attorney General, powers he says should have never been taken away. A bill filed by State Senator Bryan Hughes would give the Texas Attorney General the ability to prosecute election violations. KLTV7's Michael Richardson spoke with Senator Hughes and a member of the Texas Civil Rights Project who testified against this proposed law.
In 2021, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the Attorney General could not unilaterally prosecute election law cases. State Senator Bryan Hughes is looking to change that.
This was a bizarre ruling by the Court of Criminal Appeals. We believe they got this wrong, and we need to fix it. And so this bill will give that authority back to the Attorney General.
If a law enforcement agency submits a criminal report and legal action has not been taken for 6 months, the Attorney General would have the power to prosecute the case.
Some folks are trying to make this sound like some radical change we're making. We are restoring what the law has been since at least 1951.
I think it would make it scarier to vote in Texas.
Veronica Worms of the Texas Civil Rights Project testified against the bill during last week's public hearing. She says the law would deter people from voting out of fear of being prosecuted for making a mistake.
So this would be hugely problematic in that it overly criminalizes the elections process, takes away discretion for prosecution from local DAs.
Senator Hughes is not the only lawmaker championing the legislation. In the House, there are identical versions of the proposed law. Michael Richardson, KLTV7 News.
And that bill is currently pending in committee.